Hi guys, and welcome to ASP.NET Core Part 2. So in this session, we're gonna do a quick review of what we went over previously in Part 1, and then get into all of the Razor pages as far as the directives, how the pages work, their routing, and everything that's entailed with a Razor page. With that said, let's go ahead and get started. So here we are with the Visual Studio and the sample application we created in part 1. And basically we kind of reviewed all the dependencies, how the project is launched when you're running the application. We talked about the www root folder and all of the static files that it has, how the fave icon works and displaying in the browser's tab. And then we talked about the pages, which is the Razor pages, and how they are server-side, and when you have a URL, it'll map to one of these pages. And we'll go a little bit deeper into that and how this mapping happens, or the Razor mapping. And then we talked about the app settings, and this is basically the configuration that you can put within your application, so you can then read these config values and do something with it. And lastly, we kind of went over the program.cs, where the application uses the web application that the ASP.NET folks have created. Is a builder pattern where you create a builder and then you add the services in here. And the two important things to remember in ASP.NET Core is that when you're working with the Razor pages, you add the from the builder services, you add the Razor page. And when you do that, we just do configuration for these pages. It does not do anything with routing. And that actually happens when you're doing the map Razor pages. And this does all the routing for you, and we'll go into a little bit detail and how that happens. And we quickly also reviewed some of the ways that you can actually create your own type of a routing and stuff. So I kept that in there for you guys. Let's go ahead and delete that. We're not going to need that piece of code. So basically that's how it was. And now let's go ahead and talk about Razor pages. Now we did kind of quickly reviewed the Razor page, which basically this will share a layout, and that layout is underneath the shell folder with the underscore layout.chhtml. So by default, this Razor page will use the layout HTML, and how it knows to do that is by looking at this view start CSS_HTML. And if you notice here, we have a layout variable, and then we have the string layout, which is basically the layout that we have identified over here. So the pages will read this, and that's how it knows to do the default. If you want to keep your name something different, like layout 1, 2, or whatever, then you could define that here. You can also create the layout and identify which layout to use within the Razor page itself, so that it doesn't by default pick the one that you have identified in the view start. And we'll take a look at that as well. So next we have these directives. The way the Razor syntax works is that you have to start with a @ sign, and then you have certain keywords, and those are currently now the directives in here. So @page and @model are the two directives. The @page basically identifies this as a Razor page, and then @model basically is referencing the index model, which is the code behind that we had seen over here. And then you can also have just an @ sign with the curly braces and have some kind of a C# code in here. You could also do, for example, an @ sign and do an if condition, and if it's true, and then do something here. You could definitely write that piece of code in there as well. You could actually then take this and put something like this. So you're now mixing C# and HTML, and the Razor engine that is going to read this file and parse it is going to be smart enough to know how to differentiate between the actual code versus the literal HTML string that you have in here. So this of course is going to be always true, so we're not going to have that, but I just wanted to show you as an example that you could actually put piece of code in there. So having the add page can do a lot of different things for you. When you have a CSS HTML page and you put the add page directive, basically we'll take this and turn it into almost a MVC action. And so once it's identified internally, when you set this map razor pages, it's going to go and read all of the pages, and it's going to look for that add page, and it's going to set the routing correctly. So the reason when we launch this application, you type index without the CSS HTML, it knows how to map because the page has been identified, and it takes the name and it generates a internal link for this. And we can see that into doing something a little bit more advanced. And now I have set up my program so that I can actually do debugging of the actual code for ASP.NET Core. And if you want to see how I did that, I'll put a link. Or you can just do Googling on it and how to set this up. And you can, although this is not required for any kind of a development. I'm only doing this to show you how internally that a routing happens and how this page directive actually works. So if we launch our application, I'll put a breakpoint here. And now that we hit the breakpoint, we'll go ahead and step into this method. And the one that we are interested in is in this one. And once this piece of code is executed, we get this creative factory. We pass it the endpoints, which is the application. We get a data source. When we open this data source, we have some endpoints here. And the endpoints are /error index, index, and privacy. And we'll explain why we have these two indexes. So if we look over here, we have our index, we have our privacy, and we have our error page in here. So that's where that information, let's go back to where we were. There we go. So this is the endpoints. Here we go. So now you can see that we have all the pages identified here. But then why do we have two for index? Because index is the default within a folder in MVC. That means that it's going to have the index /index, and this actually has been identified as a route pattern, so it's index. But then the second one will just be blank, and that is how it knows that when we run this application, we come to the root and we're seeing the index page. It knows that because the routing that we did over here has 2 for an index. It will always have that. So if we create a new folder in here and call it, test or whatever, and we put a index page inside of that, then it's going to create 2 routes for that as well. And one is going to be the index, and one of it will be blank. So let's go ahead and do that really quick. And we'll call this test. And we'll just go ahead and copy this. So of course the name didn't take because I'm into debugging. So we'll go ahead and stop that, and we'll call this test. And I'll go ahead and copy this and paste this in here. There we go. So now when we execute this, I think we might get an error. Yep, we do. And the reason we're getting an error is because it says that this class already exists. Because if you go here, we had this, and they all reside in the same namespaces. So if we do pages and then we do test on this, then we no longer should get that error. So everything is good now. So let's go ahead and run this again. So we're not going to go into this now because we know what it's going to look like. So if we now do test and hit enter, we get the index page inside of that folder. And now if I do index, we'll get back the same page. So that's how that routing of that add page directive works. But you can do a little bit something more to that. And if you wanted to override the routing, you could do that actually over here, just like we did over here. You can actually identify, do your own routing dynamically, or you can come to this page Just make sure we're in the right one. You can come in here and you can say, if anyone says foo, then we wanted to have it route into this page. So let's go ahead and run this. And let's not breakpoint into this anymore. Whoops. Okay. One thing I'm going to do is I'm going to clear all of my browser settings. And the reason I'm doing that is make sure there's nothing cached. So now if I refresh this, I come back in here to the index page in the root folder of my web. So it's going to go to the test folder, then foo, and now we are able to come into this. So now if I put nothing in here, we no longer get to have that index page in there because we overwrote the values that was supposed to read by default. So now we're being very explicit. So that's the page directive, and we actually went over how the routing stuff works by having to review some of this. Next, we have this at model. So the at model makes it a little bit easier to where now that you have reference to this index model, then within your code, so if we go back in here, let's actually go to the, let's actually delete this folder because we don't want to get confused. And let's go inside of this one. And let's actually just create a property. We can keep this as a string and keep it as my property and leave it there and keep it as public. And now we can go to the index page in here. So then we can say at model my property. So now I'm able to access the model and then get the property. How this was done was that dynamically the Razor engine within this Razor page read this index model, read this directive, and said, okay, now we're gonna have everything. This class is now accessible through using model and then dot property. So that makes it a little bit easier to access. And notice that we had to put this at directive in order to get access to the object and then the property of that object. So next let's talk about how the Razor page is able to access the C# keywords and stuff. If we come in here, we have this thing called view imports. In here we have some tags, and then we have the namespace for the web application itself, and then we have the using web application. So all of the, so you have this tag helper star, and then you have the ASP.NET tag helpers. If we go to the layout page, you'll notice that this is HTML, but then all those tags are kind of brown, and then you have these purple references as well. So these are, and if you bring your cursor over it, you'll notice that this is the Razor tag helper that sets up the styling. It has some other references here for that. So then how is it that you can access these? Well, that's because there's this page. You can set all of these namespaces and the tag helpers references so that all the pages will share that and read that information. So now if you go to your Razor page or the code behind for the Razor page, you have this references here. And how is it that it is not shared when you're over, going back over here? Now, the reason for this is actually pretty simple because this was very specific for the CSS/HTML. If you want to have the references be shared across all of the code behinds, then that's easy to do. You just right-click and create a new C# class, and let's call it using. And then just delete all of this code, and let's go here and copy this and paste it. Now, if we comment this out, okay, so I think I know what happened here. In order for this to actually work, I need to put the keyword global in front of them. Oops. There we go. So now if I come in here, now everything works. So that view imports, it works exactly like this. And if we go to our index page and we comment that out, that also works. So this is another way you can control the namespacing, so it keeps the pages a little bit more cleaner, so you don't have to worry about any of the additional using statements that you have above over here. But if you didn't want to do that, you can still have, you can come over here and let's say you can put a using statement and have things like the system or something very specific in here, right? So you can still do that. So now we also said in our previous part one that we would create a blog post on how to work with Razor Pages, but I wanted to kind of go over all of the, not all of the information that we have or that you're going to need in order to build that ahead of time, so that when we do go over how to use this into creating a blog engine, a very simple one, so you don't have to learn multiple things at one time. You can just basically index this information at the back of your head, and then once we actually start doing the coding and building those pages for the blog, then things will make more sense. It'll be much easier for you to remember and create those pages for yourself or something totally different that you might want to do. But this should hopefully give you some idea of how the Razor Pages worked. So now let's go ahead and take a look at how the layout stuff is working. So what we're going to do is actually go to the Bootstrap homepage and get some examples that we can actually use as a second layout and start seeing how we can manipulate other CSS/HTML pages to use different layouts. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to getbootstrap.com. So from here, as you can see, we're in the current version. If you wanted to check out other versions, previous version samples, you could do that as well. So we go to examples. And here you have a bunch of examples that you can use. So let's actually see what we can do in finding one that will be very specific for us. We should pick something really simple, nothing too complex. So there's quite a few of them in here. And I think maybe this one. So this is actually a good one that we can use. So now if we go back to the top, and you have the download examples, or you can go to get the source code. Let's go ahead and click actually both of these links and see what the differences are. So they're both zip files that are being downloaded. Let's go ahead to our download folder, and let's go ahead and extract these. I'm going to go ahead and unblock this since it's not trusted by my computer, and that is why we're getting this message. Now that is done, let's go ahead and extract that data. Let's do the same thing for, and let's keep that in here open. Let's do the same thing on this one. Okay, so now we have the Bootstrap example and also the actual source code. So if we go here, you can see that we have the different layouts in here. And if we go here, there's very specific ones. So the one that we were interested was this navbar static. So there should be one here, navbar static. So this is the one that we're looking for. So if we open this, okay, let's go ahead and close this. So this is basically what we bring in. And now this is the static. And what we want to do is we want to open this with Visual Code. Let's go ahead and copy the nav static. And that's what we're going to go ahead and call our layout. So we're just going to add a new item. And let's go ahead and call this nav static. And copy that. Now what we want to do is we want to make sure that what we are copying here has all this information, but we want to keep this render section, right? So let's go ahead and delete this. We'll paste our code here. Let's keep the meta. And the head, so we go back to the top. We can do is split our screen here. And so we want to replace this. And we want to keep the body. So let's go down to the body section. So here's our body, and here's where the form is. This is the main container. So what we want to do is replace this, or pretty much over here, we can just comment this out. And paste our body in here. And then now we can go ahead and delete that and fix this. So that is our layout. Now this layout had the navbar top CSS. So what we need to do is go back on top and see where that's being referenced. Let's go ahead and do a quick search to see. There we go. So this is where it's being referenced. Let's go ahead and take a look. So now this is expecting this to be at the root, but what we want to do is we want to put the CSS over here. So let's go ahead and copy this. And paste the file there. Now we can close these guys. So now if we look at this layout, you'll notice that the tilde sign / CSS site is the actual path that you want to be, because that's where we're referencing the site one. So let's just copy that and then go to our nav status and do the same thing in front of this one. So that would be the CSS for that. Now we do have some other references here, which is the and then of course we have this assets Bootstrap main. So let's just make sure that the in the libraries we have Bootstrap, and then we have the CSS, and this is of course the Bootstrap min CSS, the minified version of it, which is over here. So we need to make sure that this reference is set correctly, and to do that, let's go back to our layout and see how we are referencing the Bootstrap. And if you noticed, we are going to the lib directory from the root, the Bootstrap, and so what we need to do is copy this, go back here, and paste that over here. And then we have this styling that is very specific for this layout. So for now, we'll keep that there, but we'll come back and fix this. So this should be the new layout, and what we need to do is test this out. And so right now will be a good point to actually discuss these different folders. So the pages and the shared folder are very specific folders within the ASP.NET Core. So this is where it will always look for the Razor pages to do the mapping of and the routing that happens, and the share folder is where the layouts are. So these are very special folders that the Razor engine would be looking for when it can find something. And we'll see an example of that by naming our layout incorrectly, and then we'll see there's an error, and the error will tell us how the search happened, and you'll see that this folder is being searched and the information is not being found. So let's go ahead and create a subfolder, and we'll call this one test like before. And in here, what we want to do is create a Razor page. And this Razor page, we'll just create an empty one. And we'll just name it index because we want this to be the root of that folder. So there's nothing in here. And what we want to do now is copy this main information that was in here. And we want to put that inside of this. And let's go ahead and uncomment that. So actually a good point here is that notice how the comments are happening. We have the @ which is the directive, and then the star starting the comment, and then the @ and the star, and then the @ ending the comment. So if we remove that, we get our HTML. So this should be okay because we just need this for the display. Now the next thing is if we go in here, actually over here, we can actually tell this layout to be our navbar. So let's copy the name for our layout. And this, of course, is going to be the code behind. Oh, not code behind. Over here. And save this. Let's go ahead and run our application. And of course, we have an error. So now we're running into an error because this @ is being interpreted as if this word was a keyword within the Razor engine or piece of code. And to fix this, generally, if you need to have an @ and have it escape, you just put another @ in front of it, and that'll escape it. So now if we run this, everything should run just fine. And the CSS will function properly. So now so this is now our index page. So now if we go to the test page, and this is what our page with the new layout looks like. So there's various ways that you can actually set this layout. You can actually do that if you go into the view start. And what you can do here is you can put code in here to say if a certain condition is met, use one layout versus another one. So now let's go ahead and actually put a breakpoint here so we can see what's happening. Let's go ahead and put, for example, test. So now we are breaking into this view start. So what it means is that the view start is going to be executed every single time when a page is requested. So this is why the layout is getting set. So then if we go to our locals, and you can see our locals, we have this, which is the current context. In the current context, we have the context keyword. And inside of this, we have the request object. And then if you open the request object, there's a path. And the path basically is telling us where it's going to. So we could put an if condition saying that if it ends with test, choose a different layout. Now you can come in here also and see that we have some other additional information in the context as well. So we're not gonna, at this point, not gonna go over any of this. So of course you do have your layout, which is null because we haven't set anything. You also have a path. This path is actually the current file that's being read and executed. So let's go ahead and stop this, and then we can do the context, right, dot request, and then from this we can choose the path, and then do toString, because we're going to convert it to a string and say ends with, and if it ends with test, and we are also going to do a string comparison with current culture ignore case. So let's put a if condition in front of this. And then we put an else. And this will go into the else. So everything else is going to have this layout. But when and let's actually go back to our, is this the correct index? It is. So let's just actually copy this, go back here and paste that. So this would be another way to set this. Let's go ahead and run this to make sure it actually works. So in this current context, we should have this layout, which is the default, which will be the home page. And it is. So now if we put the test, we should have the other layout. So you could have something pretty dynamic in here to choose which layout to select for your for the page, the current page that's being shown. So that's it for the layout. Let's move on to our next topic. Actually, I just remembered, so before moving on to our next topic, let's actually name this incorrectly, because I did say that I was going to show you the search order that the ASP.NET Core will have when it can find something. So let's go ahead and run this application. So everything should come out correctly, because we're going to be heading the index on the home page, and it'll have the layout, which is correct. And now when we hit the test, it should fail. And it does, and we have a exception in here that has a lot of information about the endpoint we're going to, the route values. We have the header information, if you had any cookie, any query string, and you actually have the stack trace. And the stack trace is how what was executed in the specific order before we run into the error, which is trying to get the layout page, and that is what is failing because the file is not found. And if we look at this, you can see that we're going to the pages and then to the test, and then we're looking for the view in there. Then we're going to the pages, so we just go on one level up to look for that, and we can't find it. Then we go to pages shared and see if we find it, and we can't find it there either. Then we actually go to views folder, something that we don't have as a folder within in here, and then it's going to shared as well, and then the navbar CSHTML, and this will be this is actually for the MVC side where you're using views, and we haven't used that yet, so that's why we don't have a folder for it, so we'll just leave that alone for now. So that's basically what you're getting. Now, as far as how you got this error and would you get this in production, you won't. And remember when we were talking about the error handling, we have this configuration set over here that if the environment is not development, then we show the error page, which is over here. And this error page is pretty simple. It's just showing the request ID that's being displayed. Let's go ahead and stop this. And what we're going to do is go back to our programs, just remove this. Go this way, we're forcing it that even though it's development to go in here. Oops, I commented too much. There we go. So now if we run this, we should take a look at the error page that's going to be displayed as if we were in production. We could have gone, of course, and changed the environment variable that was using, so it's not development, it's production, but this is a lot easier to uncomment. So we have our page, and now if we go to test, we actually go to a error page and it's displaying something happened, and we have a request ID that we can contact the site support and give them this information. Now, of course, you would have to go to this error page. In here, when you're setting those error and getting the trace identifier with the current ID, if you're getting a current ID versus the identifier, you would set that as request ID, and that is what is being set for the request ID is being displayed to the user. So you would actually then log that into some database or something that you would have. Now let's go ahead and go back to our program.cs and undo the @ sign so that this way we are actually in our production, we always see the error. Let's actually stop this. Let's go ahead and reset everything to the way it was. And here, let's just fix this properly. There we go. So this is back to normal, so we should not see any errors. All right, so now we can go to our next topic. So about our next topic, we'll talk about the CSS magic that happens. I don't know if you noticed that, but if we launch the application and we go view source, notice we have this styling sheet over here. And it says web application.style.css, and it has a versioning information in front of it. Now, if we were to click on this, then you can actually see the CSS that's inside of this style sheet file. And if we go to our layout, and you notice that we do have a reference. But if you were trying to go identify where the CSS resides, you won't find it. There is no such CSS. Then how is it that it's able to do this? Well, internally, what it's doing is that actually the layout does have a CSS, which is the same name as the CSHTML, and Visual Studio is good enough to identify that. And it does a parent-child to it. So the name of it is going to be the same, except it'll have the CSS for file extension. If you open it, this is actually the same exact file that we saw in here. So by this URL, we were able to get that. Well, how does that mapping happen? Basically, what it does is that it asks for the web application, which is the assembly that we compile. So this is the actual assembly name, and that's exactly the same name. So if we were to actually go to our bin directory and debug and .NET 6, notice that this is our web application .1.dll. So this is the assembly name, and then it's saying get me the style CSS. So internally, ASP.NET Core, what it's doing is it's grabbing this, it maps the URL to this CSS for the specific page that you're referring to. And then that is what you are actually seeing. Now, to showcase why you would want to do this and how it happens, generally when you're writing CSS, you would actually have one giant CSS in here that would have all of your styling for all the different pages on your site. But this becomes a little hard to manage because as the CSS grows, you may forget who's referencing which part of the CSS, which part of the CSS is not being used. So it can get a little complicated. So what you could do is the shared CSS, you would put it into this site.css. And then for page-specific ones, you would actually put it in here. So then how does ASP.NET Core able to handle this? Well, what we can do is to see an example of how this actually happens. Let's go ahead and copy this, and we will actually paste it. Actually, stop this. And then paste this, and we'll call this layout 2. Okay. And then, so now that we got this layout 2, it will also rename our CSS for us. Now what we're going to do is we're going to actually cut everything out of this, like so. And then we want to go to our Bootstrap, and we're going to pick the blog example. So I'm going to go ahead and open this with Visual Studio Code, and I'm going to copy everything. I'm going to put it into the template. Actually, I put this in the wrong file, so it should be in the CSS.html. That's why the formatting was off. And now that we insert this information, let's go ahead and also grab the blog CSS. So if we were to go back up here on the top, so we have to fix this CSS Bootstrap to make sure it's pointing to the correct place, but also we should have a reference to the blog.css that is expecting to be in the same folder. Since this is file-based, everything is residing there, so it will find it. But what we want to do is, instead of having this added to our CSS like we did to the navboard top.css, we want to include that in here. So what we need to do is comment this guy out. Next, you have some styling here. This is actually not being used, so we can actually delete this. And let's go to our layout. Not this one. Let's grab this path, and we need to fix this. There we go. And then what we need to do over here is that we need to go back to this layout and just copy that same reference. And let's paste that. And then what we need to do is go to our layout 2 CSS.html CSS and grab the blog information. So let's copy that. And let's paste this here. Now we're going to go to our view start, and we're going to comment this. Well, let's take out the layout because we're going to change this to be a layout 2. And we want this to be for that test folder index that we created here. Now there's a couple of things that's going to happen when we try to run this to see if it's working. There will be an error, first of all. So if you run the application, we got an error. So it's saying that the name does not exist in the current context. So if we double click on this, we go into this where the footer has a reference to the Twitter, but it has an @ sign. So remember, we had this error before, so we just have to escape it, and that should fix this issue. The next issue is if you run this. So this runs, and let's go ahead and go to test. We actually get another error, and it's saying it's unhandle exception while processing the request. It's able to find the layout, but it's saying that it's ignoring the body request. So it's saying render body or section. So remember that when we have a template, it's going to have to need something to render in its body. If we go to this layout and we go to the bottom, we have this render body method executed. So we have to have something in here or some section. So let's go back to our layout, and we're going to go ahead and put this in here. And now if we refresh this, let's do a hot reload. And now you can see that we have the blog page being displayed for us, and we have that render section as part of our index file over here being rendered at the bottom. So now if we right click and say view page source and we go to the web application, you can see that we have some styling, but it's a little bit more than what we have for the layout 2, right? So what the ASP.NET did for us, it took the layout from the very first page that we went to, and then it put together the layout number 2 into one CSS. So every time we make a request, it grabs everything for us. So let's go ahead and duplicate this and take this out. So now if we go to view source and navigate, and it has the same styling. So let's go close that. Now what you saw here is called the CSS isolation and ASP.NET Core. And that's how you can actually have the best of both worlds, where your CSS, as you go navigate from page to page, it gets collected, and also within your application, you can actually have your CSS more manageable to you by having it being very specific to the layout you're working with. Okay, so let's talk about the next topic. So if we were to go to our layout, we have the render body, but then at the bottom here we have this await keyword, which looks like this is a async method, and it's also denoted with the async prefix on the method. So it's running this method, and it's saying that render the section called scripts, and if it's required, equal to false. Now if I set this to true, we should get an error, and the reason for that is that anyone who inherits from this layout, when we're setting it to true, we're saying that there should be a render section script within that. So currently we have, actually let's close all of these guys so we can get a little bit of clean. Okay, there we go. So let's keep this layout open, and we want to open the index. So basically what we're saying is that there should be a section called scripts. Since this index is inheriting and using the layout, there should be one in here, and there isn't one. So if we run this, we should see an error. And sure enough, we see that it says cannot find the section scripts. So the true or false value controls whether if it exists versus not, it's still gonna function properly. But if it does exist, then it's going to go ahead and render that section. Let's keep it to false. And this time, let's go in here, and we need to do is put a section where it'll have a script. Now to do that, I'm going to create a dummy JS file. So let's go ahead and create a new item. And this will be JavaScript file, and let's call this, actually just keep it as JavaScript. We just keep it this simple with the same default name, and we won't create anything in there, but we'll just have this here empty. And then inside of this, now we need to render that section. So to render that, what we need to do is have our directive, and then next we're gonna have a section, and in this section we're gonna name it, and that's going to be scripts because that's what it's looking for. And then we'll put our curly brackets in there, and in here what we want to do is we're gonna go ahead and create the script tags, and then for the source, it's going to be javascript.js. So that actually was inside of a JavaScript, so let's go ahead and do that. There we go. It's good that the IntelliSense is helping us out. So now all we need to do is have that in there. So let's just do a hot reload, and then let's go ahead and refresh. We should now see our JavaScript file rendered over here, and there it is. So if we were to actually go and create another page, and this time we'll just create a empty Razor page, and we'll call this index1. Click add. So this should also inherit from the layout. And let's go ahead and do another hot reload for this. So now it's asking for us to rebuild and apply changes. No problem. We'll go ahead and do that. And it's going to relaunch our application. And this time, if we say index 1, it's going to basically have an empty. And if we go look at view source, we're not going to see that JS file in here. So you can actually have, your own section here, name it whatever you want, and then in the layout, if you want to render it, you can go ahead and use the render section to be able to render the whatever you have inside of this section. So next, let's talk about the CSS that we have here, or also the JavaScript. But these are the ones that we generate and create for ourselves. And then we have this folder called lib, which is short for library. And then inside of that, we have Bootstrap, jQuery, and some other JavaScript stuff in here, right? So how do you, this was a templatized. So when we installed this template, we got all this information. But how do we upgrade this? So for example, if we were to go to the Bootstrap, notice this is version 5.10. Now, if we were to go, for example, to our blog that we got, and this is version 5.2, and if you scroll down to where the blog is, which is right here, and if we open this, you'll notice that this is a little bit different than the blog that we had. If we run our application again, and then let's go to the test. So now that we are in the test page where we are showing our blog, we are not quite seeing some of the styling that we have here. So for example, this link, this link is actually disappearing, that this is not black, and the titles really should be different color. They should be white. So if we were to do a comparison between these two, notice that they are everything else is the same except some of this background stuff, right? And the reason for that is because we have different versions. So how do you update the version in Visual Studio when you're updating your Bootstrap or your jQuery to the most current version? So what you can do basically in Visual Studio, you can just right click and say add, and go over to the client-side library. And this is going to use libmin, which is the library manager. And the provider is going to be using the CDN.js. And in here, let's just type Bootstrap. So now you can get the Bootstrap, and now it's looking for the latest version. And here's all the files that you have. You can choose which files you want versus if you want to include everything. You click install, it's going to update your Bootstrap here. Now, before we do that, let's go ahead to this distribution that we have and call this one old. And then we're going to update this. But one thing else I wanted to point out is that if you run your application, you're actually, even though we call this old, it should no longer find the CSS. But we're able to see the CSS in here. Well, how did that happen? So if we go to the inspect section, let's go over to the network, and if we refresh this, everything is looking fine. There's no issues. It's able to find the Bootstrap and everything else. The reason it's doing that is because it's caching this locally, and so it's no longer making a request to the network and picking this up from our cache, which are temporary folder where the Edge browser dumps all of its web information that it gets. So if I was to do clear the browsing data from all time, and now if I refresh, I should see some errors in here. And it's no longer, so the styling goes away and we can't find this information. Now, there's one way to, you can override this to where it will always go and get the latest information. So if we go to our shared layout, notice that the CSS that we have this thing called ASP append version, which is the tag helper, and it's set to true. This, if you were to look at the view source on this, you'll notice that it actually has a question mark and a V equals and then some number, and then same thing for the application. But our Bootstrap does not. So what happens is that this is more of a browser thing, where if you're calling a static file and that static file exists in your temp area where the browser holds information, it's not going to go make a network round trip and get that information. But if it goes to this URL and it has this randomized value in here, then it's going to say, oh, this actually doesn't exist. I'm going to go get the latest one because this is making the URL unique. So if you didn't have this, it would just say go look for bootstrap.main.css. So since it sees that locally, it will never go to the network to get that. But having this will force it to go to the network and get its latest one. So just something to point out. So now what we can do is actually close that, and we're going to go ahead and now go back in here on our Bootstrap, and we're going to update this. You can just right click, same as before I showed you. So go back to client library and then type Bootstrap. So here's Bootstrap, and now we got the latest. Now notice where it's trying to dump it. It's trying to dump it into root of the Bootstrap. That's not where we want. We want this to be have the dist folder, and that's where we want to install this. If this file doesn't exist, this folder does not exist, it will actually create it for us. Now the reason we're doing this is because our pages are referencing our Bootstrap from this location. If it was in the root, it would get an error. So click install. So now we got the latest one. So if we go to our Bootstrap, you'll notice that we have version 5.2. Let's close this. Let's run our application. So now if we go to our test, now everything looks okay. We have our correct formatting because we have our latest Bootstrap in here. So now that we have that, the next thing to point out is that the Visual Studio created this JSON file for us where it has the library manager's version. It's going to CDN.js and all the libraries that it knows about. So since we only did the Bootstrap, it now knows that this is the version and this is the location, so that you can have this part of your package when you're building and doing different things. When we talk about deploying ASP.NET applications to your production, your build will need to have a way to be able to package this. Now, generally, when you're doing it in production and your development, and you're working for a company, you would have this under source control, and you wouldn't want to have this stuff under your source control because this takes space in there, and you don't want to do that. So all you want to do is have this as a reference, and then when you're going to deploy it, your build server would account for going to this CDN and get its latest that you specified the version and get that for you. So for the last topic, we're going to go over how to create forms and how to post them and how to accept the data that is coming and do the data binding on it. So here I've created a simple form example.cshtml Razor page, which just has the default, and if you look at the code behind, doesn't have anything in there. So we don't need to have these because remember that we have all our namespaces in the using statement under the usings, so we can keep that over there. We also said that there is another property we need to put, but it's going to have the onPost, and onPost is going to get activated when you are submitting the form. So when you're submitting forms, it can be a post or it could be a get. So we want this to be as a post. If you do it as a get, everything will come as a query string, but for this one we're going to keep it clean, so we just have to do with post. Now over here, what we need to do is just create a very simple form. But before we do that, I'm going to actually create a property here, and I'm going to call this string, and I'm going to name this name. So now we have this property. Then what we can do over here is now we're going to create the form, and we're gonna choose its method for what we want to do, how to post this, which is going to be using the HTTP verb post. Then we want to do is create a label, and on the label we're going to have some description, and then we're going to create a input, and the input is going to accept some text value. Now in order to do data binding to this value, what we need to do is come into the label and use some ASP tag helpers. So we're just going to say ASP4, and it's going to ask us what is this going to be for, and this one is going to be name. And notice that it was able to identify the property name because we already have that in our code behind. So next, for the input, we can do the same thing. We can say ASP4 and use name, and then we're going to have a button that's going to submit our data. So its type is going to be submit, and let's just call this submit as well. So that's pretty much all you have to do on this. Now in order for this binding to work, you need to have an attribute, and this attribute is going to be called bind property. So now if we run our application and then navigate to our form example, we have our name, and we're going to go ahead and use test and click submit. But before we do that, let's go ahead and put a breakpoint on this and click submit. So now we can go look at this context and notice that our name has the value test. By doing the data binding, you don't have to worry about reading the form and its values and having to create an object and then set that over to a to send it to your database or someplace else where you can do something with it. Now, if you do want to see how to do this without data binding, and how you would get this is you would go to the request object, and the request object should have a form, and the form will have some values to it. So we have the keys. The keys is basically name, and this is the request verification token. This is something internally that ASP.NET is going to be using to verify that the values are properly formed. So here, if we go look, we can see that the name, the key, has a value of test. So we can tell that the value got populated for us, and that's pretty much how you do a very simple form. In the later tutorials, of course, we will go over some of the complex ways of having to do the data binding, having multiple values in here. So that should conclude our tutorial for today and everything that we reviewed for part 2. And part 3, now we will take everything we've learned in the part 1 and part 2 and actually create our blog engine. That's it. Thank you so much and have a good day. We'll see you in the next tutorial.